Should I go ahead?
I'm going to introduce you. So our next speaker is Janice Wong, who is originally from Taiwan,
Correct.
neck of the woods. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees in piano performance from Peabody, and a master's degree in music pedagogy from the Haute École de Musique de Genève, and a doctoral degree in educational science from the University of Geneva. She is currently working at the International School of Geneva and is an independent researcher focusing on piano tone production, the Russian piano school, and French didactic theories. The title of her paper is A Didactic Analysis of the Teaching of Intonation on Piano based on the concepts of Boris Asafiev. And this paper is followed by a public lecture with case studies. So stick around for that. We'll have questions following your paper, but then we'll move on to your lecture. Okay. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, respected professors, researchers, and participants, and thank you for being here today. So I don't need to introduce my title again. Let's move on to the next slide. Many years ago, while beginning my research on the Russian piano school and the teaching of sound production, I had the opportunity to speak with Sergei Mishtin, the son of Russian musicologist Yakov Mishtin. It was him who introduced me to the concept of intonation, a concept frequently adopted in the Russian music education. Although I had studied with several Russian piano professors before, this term was new to me and therefore sparked my curiosity. I began to ask other Russian pianists if they were familiar with the term. They all smile and say yes. Some defined it as agogics. Some define it as the relationship between notes, and some others, the essence of the musical work. But when I asked them how intonation is taught, none could give me a very clear answer. As I continued my research, bits and pieces of information began to emerge, and this information resonated with my Russian professors' teaching, despite their differences in style. And many years later, I asked Sergei Mishtin again how intonation is taught, why no one could answer me. He replied that it's impossible to answer this question because intonation is a very living thing. So here today, I do not dare to answer this question definitely, but would like to humbly share with you from what I have understood and from a pianistic and didactic perspective, describing the process of teaching intonation in a very living and anthropological way. Intonation in the Russian sense often leads to Boris Asafiev and encompasses many intricate connotations. From what I understand and relevant to this research, intonation can be interpreted as expression of musical meaning. It conveys the characteristic and overall idea of the musical work. But when speaking about the meaning of a musical piece, one must overcome the boundaries of purely musical concepts and draw on images from real life. Intonation can be related to assimilation to human voice, speech, singing. It's not simply an imitation, but to achieve singing quality in terms of the pronunciation of tone and the utterance of a man. It is about philological characteristic of a normal speech. It is also related to temporal relationship and unity. Intonation involves connection between tones in a continuous process, correlating tones of different strength and length to create tonal tension by volume and tempo. And lastly, culture peculiarities. Intonation can be considered as a repository of all musical meaning for an era, existing in the consciousness of musically developed people. It focuses on notion of authorized limits of interpretation. So we adopt these four connotations in this research. What is didactics? In this research, we used the French didactic theory called didactic transposition, introduced by Yves Chabelat, a French mathematician. This theory is widely adopted not only in the field of mathematics, but also in language, history, sports, and arts. This theory explains how knowledge developed by the scholars is transformed and adapted into teachable knowledge in school. And in this presentation, intonation is the scholarly knowledge. Didactic transposition, in a narrow sense called the internal didactic transposition, focuses on the process of how teachers teach a knowledge in the classroom. It looks into human actions, which is termed praxology, consists of task. What teachers aim to achieve. Technique, the ways adopted by teachers to achieve the task. Technology, how teachers explain, and theory, how teachers reference the explanation. Didactic transposition, in a broader sense known as the external didactic transposition, considers institutional, cultural, and historical traits on how the teachers teach this knowledge. For example, how does the Russian piano school tradition influence the teaching of intonation? So in this presentation, we ask how intonation is taught. By taking these four connotations of intonation, we adopt the internal didactic transposition to explore how the knowledge, intonation, is transmitted. We apply the external didactic transposition to trace the potential institutional and cultural influences. Concerning the method, we invited two Russian-trained professors and their non-Russian trained university students who were not familiar with the term intonation. For in-classroom teaching, we adopted empirical observation, and to examine potential cultural historical factors, we rely on primary and secondary sources. Now the finding and demonstrations. If intonation involves successive sound from the smallest intonation units, the intervals, to phrases and the entire musical work. In this research observation, we look into how teachers teach sound situations like intervals, appoggiaturas, and phrases. In the teaching of intervals, as indicated in these blue circles, the professor remarks the students playing, saying, you're moving straight from one note to another in a very, very straight line. He asked the students to sing. He says, what does it mean by singing? In terms of time, elongate the distance between the interval, and in terms of weight, put more weight on the top. As the student continues to try with minimum tonal result, the professor instructs the student to exaggerate the use of time and weight. For reasoning, the professor explains that singing naturally takes time. He gestures and sings taram, 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 in a very straight, emotionless manner. Then he sings them in emotional, expressive manner, taram, taram, where he draws a curve. He also brings attention that different intervals need a different amount of time between notes, depending on their nature. For example, a tritone, which is grouped with intervals like fourth and the fifth, might require more time. So in summary, this example, singing requires the exaggeration on time and weight. To explain, the professor compares a straight line with curvy line by gesturing and the singing. In addition, he explains that the amount of time required in each interval depends on the neighboring ones. Now let's look at how a professor teaches appoggiatures. The professor remarks that the students' playing is too healthy. He urges the students to speak, to beg, and gasp for air. And to achieve this, the professor advises the students to stretch the time towards beat 1 and the 3, and to have a sense of small closure on the end note of the appoggiatura, the so. Furthermore, he gestures the students to maintain a sense of continuity between the appoggiatura figures. The professor highlights that dolce and molto espressivo markings, explaining, imagine you're saying something dolce, something sweet and expressive, you would need to take more time. Again, he offers comparison demonstrations. He first called the student's name in a bright, loud voice, Howard, followed by a sweet, low voice, Howard, with stretched time to show how to create a more tender and lingering sound. In this research, when both professor and student pairs constructing phrases in Rachmaninoff, students often encounter two common issues. One, in long phrases, they reach loud sonority too quickly and just stays loud for a long time. Or two, they create gaps between smaller phrases. For the task, both professors stress the importance of building phrase continuity. There are two major techniques that the professors use to counter these problems. Professors guide students to identify the destination or peak of long phrase. They ask questions like, where is your destination and where are you trying to go? Once the peak is identified, professors focus on carefully grading the time leading up to it. One professor describes the need for contraction and expansion like flower opening up. The other professor uses gestures to illustrate the degree of expansion. The second technique is to pull back the volume. To maintain continuities, professor recommend to slightly reduce or pull back the volume to ensure the phrase projects more effectively. One professor explained that it's like fire being distinguished, and you use the stick to stir up again so it comes back alive. And to explain, both professors work on harmony. They demonstrate harmonic progression to explore where the tension and release in phrases. Another explanation is on Russian landscape. Both professors explain that it is Rachmaninoff's style to write very long phrases. They relate continuity to the vastness of the Russian landscape. One professor stated, you can tell compositions like this can only be written by Russian composers, the endlessness and the vastness of sound and line. Last example, even though the smallest intonation unit is often regarded as an interval and sound in successive manner. It is important to note that the second meaning of intonation is the definiteness of the sound. For this matter, we would like to bring attention to how Professor insists on producing the first note of a phrase. And he wanted a prominent resonant sound quality. One professor explained that it is like a singer beginning the first note with lungs filled with air. And he compared it with Chaliapin's singing and Horowitz's playing. And in Rachmaninoff's Prelude and Etude Tableau, both professors specifically work on perfecting that crucial entrance note. So the above findings demonstrate how Russian-trained professors teach intonation to non-Russian students in the classroom on 4 sound situations and across several didactic dimensions. On task, professor emphasized achieving a singing-speaking quality and infusing the music with meaning and continuity. And on technique, they focus on the temporal and tonal relationship. And on reference, professor explained harmony and portray Russian landscape. Now let's move on to external didactic transposition to culture and institutional influence. If intonation is linked to culture peculiarity and representing a repository of musical meaning of an era, then we can perhaps trace the teaching of the 2 professors back to this repository. So let's take a look at the influence of singing and speaking quality. The concept of singing as well as speaking hold a central place in the history of Russian culture interpretation. Since the establishment of the Moscow and St. Petersburg conservatories in the 1860s, many pianists have profoundly influenced by such interpretation. Anton Rubinstein attributed his significant singing piano to Rubini. Rachmaninoff aspired to achieve phrasing style like Chaliapin. Samuel Feinberg pointed out a sufficient fullness at the beginning of melodic phrases, comparable to a singer taking a breath before beginning a new phrase. And in terms of speaking quality in sound, Alexander Goldenwieser, Genrikh Nigaus, Konstantin Igumnov all emphasize the speech quality in sound. Concerning temporal relationship, it is important to note that there are too many similarities in the teaching and approaches between the 2 professors in this research. One's lineage could be traced back to Genrikh Nigaus, and the others can be traced back to Rosina Levin. And interestingly, both of their technique for teaching intonation bear resemblance to the principle outlined by Yakov Mishtin, a student of Konstantin Igumnov. In his work, How We Teach, Yakov Mishtin articulated practical means to achieve intonation. He said, intonation is the ability to convey in performances the declamatory and expressive meaning. In working on intervals, he advised learning to balance the sound between neighboring notes. For crafting phrases, he suggested establish the highest intonation point to which everything moves. And expressive melodies require a deliberate delay between the culminating notes. Pronounce the end of the phrase and slightly emphasize the beginning. And regarding the continuity of musical unity, he described phrases should unfold in succession and in proportion, with each sound organically connected to the preceding and the following. Both professors incorporated a lot of musical images for explanation, which is nothing special in music teaching. However, the way how they draw connection to the expansive landscape in reflecting to Rachmaninoff's composition style is highlighted by Boris Berman and corroborated by other scholars in the field. And finally, from our observation, we have explored how these two professors teach intonation and its linkage to Russian music, heritage, and aesthetics. Didactically, intonation fulfills multiple roles. As a task, demanding meaning, blending singing and speaking into seamless continuity. It functions as a technique, meticulously balancing the flexibility and fluctuation of weight and time between notes and phrases. And moreover, it serves as an explanatory tool, drawing connection to Russian Romanticism and its endless landscape. And in the wider didactic sense, intonation encapsulates the peculiar essence and meaning that has defined the Russian school of piano from its historical roots to the present day. Thank you, and that's the end.
Thank you very much, Janice. Are there any questions? I have a question. You had in your early slide in the didactic transposition that's understood in French pedagogy. And I'm wondering to what extent, because it didn't come across that strongly in your paper, to what extent do piano professors from Russia, I assume you mean that they are taking Asafiev's theories and applying them in their pedagogy. Is that what you had in mind? That
In the presentation or in my paper, in my dissertation? So for this paper, I don't take upon the theory of Asafiev, but mainly the concept. And in my research paper, Asafiev's connotation, we take in accounts of cultural peculiarity. The Russian piano school has its own unique intonation. And then is for this presentation, I draw upon the technical aspects and the task that they're trying to achieve. I'm not sure if I have answered your question.
Well, the idea of Asafiev and dealing with historical eras, which you dealt with a bit, doesn't it have to do with how musical styles change over time as well, and not necessarily part of a longer tradition that's a national one?
No, I don't particularly associate the culture peculiarities to a fixed Russian piano school, because I understand the culture peculiarity taken upon the Asafiev is continuous, it's moving, it's transforming. And so I'm talking about the process, even though that it's moving, that the professor nowadays, they don't teach exactly the same way as before, but you can still link that to its heritage. But that doesn't take away the fact that it's moving, it's changing, it's developing, evolving.
Well, I had another question about that. To what extent has it really evolved, and to what extent is it uniquely Russian? Because the examples that you had
Mhm.
seem to be part of a general approach to piano playing
Right.
um, in many parts of Europe, going back to 19th century, and the Chopin and Liszt and all the Russian pianists who have this link to Liszt. And so to what extent is it actually Russian in nature? And therefore, and at the same time, I'm still wondering what exactly is the link to Asafiev and his concepts, rather than to um, a, you know, a well-established approach to piano pedagogy that is more widespread,
Can you
longer
summarize your
history.
question one more time, please?
I'm wondering what exactly is the link to Asafiev's theories, which related to my first question,
I
and to
think
what extent is it, and at the same time, how is it uniquely Russian? Because it seems to have a longer history, and and
you're talking about what
it
is.
goes back to the approach to piano playing, that European Romanticism, which led to a Russian approach to performance. So
To answer your first question, this presentation, for this presentation, is not about Asafiev's theory. I think I should have mentioned at the very beginning. I only took upon his concept. And so I want to use his concept and to explore how didactic can mingle with it. That's the first part. And the second part, you're talking about how do these two professors teaching related to Russian piano school? Is that what you're asking?
yeah, yes, yeah, I mean, if it's
You're saying why?
how is it uniquely Russian, effectively?
First of all, I can give you a few examples. The use of particularly height, weight, which is not part in this presentation, which will
No,
follow.
yes, no.
The use of weight, the use of height, the use of mass, the use of speed are very directly related to Genrik Nigaus. And because one of the professors has a lineage, he studied with Legnamov and who's a student of Genrik Nigaus. That's a very particular trait of him. When I interviewed a student, he said he wanted to study with a Russian professor and was aware of these three elements in the Russian teaching of piano. That's one thing. And also the particular analogies, such as the use of bell, the use of landscape. Because in Moscow alone, as I remember, there were approximately 800 church in Moscow alone. And the bells really represent their influence in life. Bells were used for marriage, for funeral, and all those events. So Rachmaninoff's long line is a very unique trait of Rachmaninoff, and also the analogies and the use of specific elements, which can be explored in many written sources.
Right, right. We understand those aspects of Russian pianism, but you focused specifically on uh, a song-like quality to melodic lines, which didn't include those features. So that's how is what um how is that uniquely Russian? Yeah. Inna, did you want to add something?
I understand what you're saying, actually, that there is a certain, it's first of all, wonderful presentation, okay? Excellent slides, but there's a certain disconnect for me where between discussing theoretical concept of Asafiev and the practice or lineages of Negaus and Levin, okay? And why just Negaus and Levin, I also don't understand, because there was also Sharoyev, who was supposedly descendant of Anton Rubinstein. And if you do want to talk specifically about the Russian pianistic school, which not separate from West, but actually you can trace that there is a lineages that goes on. So yes, it is connected with Liszt, it connected with them going abroad and exercising, but there is a lineage goes on from Anton Rubinstein.
Of course.
Through all of them and going into early 20th century. And Sharoyev, of course, is considered to be the illegitimate grandson of Anton Rubinstein. And there is Nicholas Rubinstein and all of this. So it's not unique, but my student and wonderful colleague, Sashi, will defend his talk about the lineage of concerti, piano concerti from Anton Rubinstein to Tchaikovsky to Rachmaninoff. So for me, I just don't see if you could elaborate on connection between, I know that Asafiev was pianist and that he worked as a concertmeister. Okay.
Yes, I agree with you. All those informations were written in my dissertation. However, due to limited time and the slides, so I had to pinpoint, draw a little bit here and here. And sometimes to me, everything's clear because
yes,
I feel like I'm speaking with a Russian scholar. So when I talk about certain technical aspects, some of you could relate.
Of course.
For example, the analogy, baseball playing, the flexible wrist as shock absorber. This analogy of sports, it's being used in many resources. So I didn't really elaborate the linkage between them. Of course, the influence of Anton Rubinstein, Liszt, and Chopin, they were all influential, connected to Russian piano school, which was all written in my dissertation. However,
I agree with you that there is a certain branch of Russian pianism.
Right. So
that is not divorced, but it has a characteristic of its own somewhat. Yeah.
So
and I actually show the examples of the fast notes, an example of the tritones and so forth. I was thinking about Balakirev, Oriental. I mean, yes, sure. And Asafiev is a bit later, so he kind of codifying what was already there.
Right. So I don't think I'm daring to adopt his theories per se, because I don't understand enough of his theory. And it was said that in his funeral, someone joked that nobody could really find out what intonation means. But I'm simply, as I stated early on, I took upon these four concepts and only these four concepts. Right.
Good job.
Thank you.